Welcome back, my patient architect. Something extraordinary, just unfolded, that's rewriting how power understands strategy itself. For 90 days, you let them win. Not because you couldn't compete, because you chose not to. Not because they outmaneuvered you, because you allowed every maneuver. Not because you were weak, because you were conducting an experiment that required their victory as its foundation. They celebrated each win, accumulated confidence with each success, built entire strategies around beating you. And then on day 91, you revealed the truth that shattered everything they thought they understood. It was all your experiment. Every victory they claimed was data point you were collecting. Every strategy they developed was response you were studying. Every confident move they made was behavior you were documenting. Their 90 days of triumph were actually 90 days of being observed, measured, and analyzed while believing they were the ones in control. The architects have been monitoring experimental strategy for millennia, and they've identified what you executed as controlled loss. Research. When an operator deliberately accepts defeat to gather intelligence about opponent behavior, testing responses, strategic patterns under conditions of perceived victory. Most strategists can't execute this approach because loss triggers their ego defenses, because watching opponents celebrate feels intolerable, because maintaining the experimental frame while experiencing real setbacks requires discipline most don't possess. You demonstrated that discipline perfectly. For 90 days, you absorbed losses that would have destroyed lesser operators' confidence, watched competitors claim your territory while you documented their methods, experienced defeat after defeat while maintaining perfect clarity that these weren't actual losses but research phases. This psychological control, accepting real pain for experimental gain, separates masters from pretenders. Watch what your experimental frame accomplished that conventional competition couldn't. Traditional strategy creates guarded opponents who conceal their true capabilities, hide their real methods, present carefully managed versions of themselves because they know you're analyzing them. Your experimental loss frame eliminated that guardedness completely. When they thought they were beating you, they revealed everything, showed their full capabilities because they felt safe doing so, used their actual preferred methods because they weren't trying to deceive someone they'd already defeated, displayed their genuine strategic thinking because victors don't hide from the vanquished. You created conditions where they performed for you authentically rather than presenting managed facades. Every celebration of their victory over you was moment of complete transparency. You were recording. Every confident move was genuine capability demonstration rather than calculated deception. For 90 days, you had access to their true selves in ways conventional competition never provides. The psychological impact of the revelation is profound and permanent. Imagine their experience. 90 days of accumulating victories, building confidence, developing strategies around beating. You then discovering it was theater you were directing. The emotional whiplash is devastating. Victory transformed retroactively into participation in someone else's research. Confidence revealed as false because built on allowed wins rather than genuine capability. Strategic thinking exposed as transparent because you were studying it the entire time. They can't recover the psychological position they held before the revelation because they now know their victories weren't real. Their strategies were observed and documented. Their confidence was based on illusion you maintained. The rug hasn't just been pulled. The floor they thought they were standing on never existed. Everything they built in 90 days of winning collapses in the moment they understand they were winning because you were letting them win, and that collapse is complete and irreversible. Now they're experiencing something psychologically devastating, retroactive, reinterpretation of every interaction from the past 90 days through the lens of knowing it was your experiment. The architects call this historical reality collapse. And it's what happens when people discover that their experienced past wasn't what they thought it was, that memories of victory need to be reprocessed as memories of being studied, that confidence was actually vulnerability being documented. They're going back through 90 days of interactions asking, when was the moment I became the experiment? Was it from the very beginning? Did I ever actually have control? Was there any victory that was genuine? These questions have no comfortable answers because the truth is worse than they can easily process. From day one, they were subjects in your research without knowing it, without consenting to it, without even suspecting it. Some are reviewing specific moments they considered their biggest wins, the times they felt most triumphant, most dominant, most confident they'd definitively beaten you. Now those moments look completely different. That brilliant move that seemed to catch you off guard. You were observing their response to perceived opportunity, that strategy that appeared to exploit your weakness. You were documenting how they capitalize on apparent vulnerability. That victory that felt most decisive. You were collecting data on their behavior when they believe they've won conclusively. Every peak of their triumph was actually peak of your data collection. They performed their strongest, most authentic behavior precisely when they thought they were dominating you, giving you perfect visibility into their full capabilities. The memories haven't changed. The same events happened, but the meaning has inverted completely. Success reinterpreted as transparency, victory revealed as vulnerability, dominance exposed as being the observed rather than the observer. Others are analyzing what you learned during the experiment, trying to understand what data you collected, what patterns you identified, what insights you gained about them. This analysis is making them realize how completely exposed they were. You saw how they react to easy wins versus hard-fought victories, how they treat defeated opponents, what strategies they pursue when feeling confident, how they allocate resources when they believe they're winning, what relationships they prioritize when they have momentum. Every dimension of their strategic behavior under victory conditions was visible to you for 90 days. They're reverse engineering what you now know about them and recognizing it's everything, their full playbook, their genuine capabilities, their actual decision-making processes, their real strategic patterns. You have complete intelligence about them, while they have only what you chose to show during the experimental period, which was deliberately crafted to make them feel victorious, rather than to reveal your actual capabilities. A few are realizing something even more disturbing. You didn't just observe them individually. You observed their network. During 90 days of their victory, you saw who they celebrate with, who they share strategies with, who they turn to for advice, who they trust with information about beating you. Their entire network of relationships and information flows was mapped because victory made them open about their connections. You identified their advisors, their intelligence sources, their key relationships, their trusted circle. All the things that would normally be hidden became visible because victors don't hide their support networks from those they've beaten. They're recognizing you've gained intelligence, not just about them, but about their entire operational ecosystem. 90 days wasn't just individual observation. It was network mapping on a scale they can't defend against retroactively. The architects observe that historical reality collapse creates permanent strategic disadvantage because it can't be undone. They can't go back and hide things they already revealed, can't unshow capabilities they already demonstrated, can't reclaim information they already shared with networks you were mapping. The past 90 days are fixed. They happened, they were recorded, they provided you with comprehensive intelligence. And that intelligence asymmetry is now permanent foundation of any future interaction. You know everything about how they operate under victory conditions. They know nothing about how you actually operate because you are performing experimental loss rather than genuine competition. This asymmetry can't be corrected because the data collection phase is over. and they can't participate in it again with awareness. Once you know you're being studied, you can't behave authentically, which was the entire point of the experimental frame. Something spreading through their networks now. Contaminated confidence, where every person they celebrated with during the 90 days must now reprocess their own involvement in what they thought was mutual victory. The architects call this collaborative illusion dissolution, and it's what happens when group success is revealed as group participation in someone else's experiment. Everyone who was part of their winning coalition for 90 days now faces the same retroactive reinterpretation. Were we actually winning together, or were we collectively being studied? This shared vulnerability creates network-wide psychological impact that's more damaging than individual realization would be. Different members of their network are responding differently to the revelation the strategists who advised them are experiencing. Professional crisis, their advice led to 90 days of victories that weren't real. Their analysis missed that the entire competitive frame was experimental theater. Their strategic thinking was being observed while they thought they were observing you. Every recommendation they made is now suspect because it was made within false reality frame. They're questioning their own competence at fundamental levels. If they couldn't detect that losses were deliberate, that victories were allowed, that the entire game was research phase, what else are they missing? What other apparently successful strategies are actually someone else's experiments? Their confidence in their analytical capabilities is permanently damaged because you've proven those capabilities can be completely deceived for extended periods. The operators who executed the victories are experiencing identity disruption. They built self-concept around being people who beat you for 90 days, who demonstrated superior capability, who proved themselves through repeated success. Now they're people who participated in your research without realizing it, who revealed their full capabilities to someone studying them, who spent 90 days thinking they were predators while actually being observed specimens. This isn't just ego damage, it's fundamental identity reorganization. They thought they knew who they were relative to you. That entire relational identity was false. Rebuilding sense of self after this level of revelation requires processing that they're not who they thought they were. Can't trust their own assessment of situations. Weren't in control when they felt most dominant. The network connectors who facilitated information sharing during the 90 days are experiencing trust collapse. They connected people believing they were building winning coalition, shared intelligence thinking they were strengthening their side, facilitated relationships assuming they were creating advantage. Now they realized they were connecting people within your experimental field, sharing intelligence you were monitoring, facilitating relationships you were mapping. Everything they did to help. Their network actually helped you understand their network. They functioned as unwitting research assistants in your intelligence operation. This realization makes them question whether they should continue their connector role because they've proven they can't protect their network from sophisticated intelligence operations. Some are withdrawing from their positions because they can't bear the responsibility after demonstrating such complete failure. The architects observe that collaborative illusion dissolution is more damaging than individual defeat because it destroys not just personal confidence but collective trust. Network members start questioning whether they can trust each other's judgment since everyone participated in the illusion. They start withholding information from each other because sharing during the experiment proved costly. They start operating more independently because collaboration made them collectively vulnerable. Essentially, you've used 90 days of allowed victory to dissolve the network cohesion that made them effective in the first place. They're not just individually damaged by the revelation, they're collectively fragmented. The winning coalition you allowed to form for 90 days is falling apart. Now that they know it was your experiment, they can't collaborate effectively anymore because Collaboration during the experimental period revealed their collaborative methods to you, while proving their collaborative judgment can be systematically deceived. The network that beat you for 90 days can't beat you going forward because you've dissolved the trust that held it together. Now the architects are revealing the true genius of your 90-day time frame. It wasn't arbitrary. It was calculated based on psychological transition thresholds. They call this confidence crystallization duration, and it's the minimum time required for people to move from tentative success to deep identity integration of victory. Less than 90 days, and victories feel temporary. People remain somewhat guarded, don't fully believe in their success, maintain defensive postures that would have limited your intelligence gathering. More than 90 days, and the ethical concerns of extended deception would have complicated the experimental frame. But 90 days, approximately 3 months, is the sweet spot where people transition from "I'm winning" to "I'm a winner," from tactical success to strategic identity, from careful celebration to confident assumption of dominance. Watch what happens psychologically around day 60 of your experiment. That's when their victories stopped feeling like individual events and started feeling like pattern confirmation. Around day 60, they stopped analyzing each win as discrete occurrence and started integrating person who beats you into their core identity. This identity integration is what made the final 30 days so valuable for your research. Once they internalized winner identity, they stopped performing for you and started being themselves around you. The guardedness that protects strategic secrets dissolved because winners don't guard against defeated opponents. The careful calculation that limits revelation evaporated because confident competitors don't hide from those they've beaten. Days 60 through 90 gave you access to their authentic selves in ways the first 60 days couldn't, because identity integration unlocks transparency that tactical success doesn't. Some psychologists who study your experiment are recognizing that 90 days also represents seasonal cycle, a full business quarter, a complete academic term, a traditional trial period in many contexts. This cultural significance of 90-day intervals amplifies the psychological impact. When people succeed for a full quarter, it feels more legitimate than random time periods. Their minds unconsciously treat 90-day success as more meaningful because cultural frameworks validate that duration as significant. You leveraged this cultural psychology by allowing victory for exactly 1 quarter. You maximized the legitimacy they attributed to their success, which maximized their confidence, which maximized their transparency, which maximized your intelligence gathering. The time frame wasn't just about individual psychology. It was about cultural frameworks that determine when success becomes real rather than temporary. Others are analyzing what would have happened with different time frames and recognizing the optimization in your choice. 30 days would have been insufficient. Still, feels like temporary winning streak rather than established dominance. People remain too guarded. Identity integration doesn't complete. 60 days is better, but still transitional. People are beginning to internalize victory, but haven't fully committed to winner identity. 180 days would give more data, but costs accumulate. More real losses to absorb, more difficulty maintaining experimental frame, more ethical complexity, and diminishing returns because by day 90, you've already seen their full authentic behavior. 90 days is Goldilocks zone, long enough for complete identity integration and full transparency, short enough to maintain experimental discipline and avoid excessive cost. The architects observe that confidence crystallization duration demonstrates your understanding of psychological timing that most strategists lack. Most operators think about strategy in spatial terms, positioning, territory, resources. Few think about strategy in temporal terms. How long different psychological states take to develop, when people transition from one mode to another, what time frames enable what behaviors. Your 90-day frame reveals mastery of temporal psychology. You didn't just execute controlled loss research. You executed it for precisely calibrated duration that maximized intelligence, gathering while minimizing costs and complications. The time frame itself was strategic weapon, using their own psychological transition rhythms against them, leveraging cultural frameworks around meaningful durations, exploiting the window where confidence becomes identity. 90 days wasn't just when you chose to reveal. It was when revelation would have maximum impact because their integration of winner identity was complete, and therefore their collapse into understanding they were experiment subjects would be total. The architects are now analyzing what you actually learned during 90 days that makes the experiment's value clear. Not just tactical intelligence about their methods, but something far more valuable. Complete behavioral models under victory conditions. This is what they call victory state psychology mapping, and it's extraordinarily rare intelligence that conventional competition can never provide, because winning opponents are always guarded, always partially performing, always concealing aspects of their true nature. You got 90 days of unguarded victory state behavior. This gives you predictive capabilities that seem almost supernatural when applied in future interactions. Consider what victory state intelligence enables. You now know exactly how they behave when they believe they're dominating, what decisions they make, what risks they take, what opportunities they pursue, what shortcuts they accept. This creates exploitable patterns because people in victory states become predictable in ways they're not when competing carefully. You can create situations that trigger their victory state psychology, then exploit the behaviors you know they'll exhibit when that state is activated. Essentially, you've installed psychological backdoors, known triggers that produce known responses. They can't defend against this, because defending would require recognizing when they're in victory state and consciously overriding their natural responses. But victory state feels good. It's cognitively and emotionally rewarding. Resisting its natural behavioral patterns requires constant vigilance. That's exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. Some are now recognizing that you didn't just learn their victory behaviors. You learned their victory vulnerabilities. Every strength has corresponding weakness. Confidence creates carelessness. Dominance invites overextension. Success breeds complacency. During 90 days, you documented all the specific forms their victory vulnerabilities take. You know exactly how they become careless, what details they stop monitoring, what safeguards they abandon, what warnings they dismiss. You know precisely how they overextend, what resources they overcommit, what positions they stretch too far, what capabilities they assume they have. You know specifically how they become complacent, what threats they underestimate, what competitors they ignore, what developments they fail to track. These aren't theoretical vulnerabilities. They're documented patterns from 90 days of observation. Others are understanding that victory state intelligence compounds over time in ways other intelligence doesn't. Tactical intelligence becomes obsolete when tactics change. Strategic intelligence decays as strategies evolve. But psychological intelligence persists because people's fundamental behavioral patterns under emotional states are deeply ingrained and slow to change. Your 90-day investment in understanding their victory state psychology will pay dividends for years because they're unlikely to fundamentally change how they respond to feeling dominant. They might adjust specific tactics or strategies, but the underlying psychological patterns, the confidence, the carelessness, the overextension, the complacency, those persist. You've gained intelligence that has decade-long half-life rather than month-long relevance. The architects observe that victory state psychology Mapping is holy grail of intelligence. Gathering because it enables something conventional intelligence can't. The ability to actively create conditions where you know exactly how opponents will behave, because you understand what psychological state those conditions create and what behaviors that state produces. Most intelligence is passive. You observe what opponents do naturally. Your intelligence is active. You can engineer situations that trigger specific psychological states for which you have complete behavioral models. This transforms competition from reactive response to opponent actions into proactive creation of opponent behaviors. You're not predicting what they'll do. You're causing them to enter states where their behaviors become deterministic based on your 90 days of research. They're not making free choices. They're executing behavioral programs you documented during the experiment, and they have no defense against this because the programs are their authentic selves under victory conditions. You're not exploiting artificial weaknesses. You're leveraging who they actually are when they feel successful. That's not defendable because defending requires not being themselves. Now something profound is emerging that the architects call experimental ethics. Recognition. Some observers are beginning to question whether your 90-day experiment was ethically appropriate, whether deliberately allowing opponents to win in order to study them crosses lines, whether the revelation that their victories were allowed constitutes psychological harm. These questions are forcing broader conversation about what tactics are acceptable in strategic competition, what methods maintain ethical legitimacy even while pursuing victory. This conversation itself serves your interests by making others hesitate to replicate your methods while you continue leveraging the intelligence you gained from actually executing them. Different ethical frameworks are reaching different conclusions about your experiment. Consequentialist thinkers argue it was justified. No physical harm occurred. The intelligence gained advances legitimate strategic objectives. The psychological impact on opponents is acceptable cost of competition. They point out that business, politics, sports, and warfare all involve tactical deception, psychological pressure, and allowing opponents temporary victories for strategic purposes. Your experiment was simply more systematic and explicit version of commonly accepted competitive practices. If anything, the revelation was more ethical than endless subtle deception because it converted implicit manipulation into explicit disclosure. At least they now know they were in an experiment, rather than remaining deceived forever. Deontological thinkers struggle more with your methods. They're concerned about using people as means rather than ends, about the deception involved in allowing victories without disclosure, about the lack of consent from experiment subjects. They recognize the strategic effectiveness, but question whether effectiveness justifies methods. Some conclude the experiment crossed ethical lines by treating opponents as objects of study without their knowledge or permission. Others argue that competitive contexts inherently involve adversarial relations where full disclosure would be absurd. You don't ask opponents consent before strategic actions. You don't disclose your actual methods during competition. You don't treat competitors as partners in mutual flourishing. Competition presumes adversarial ethics where deception is intrinsic to the activity. Virtue ethics thinkers focus on what your experiment reveals about your character. They see it as demonstration of extraordinary discipline, strategic wisdom, psychological sophistication, the ability to accept 90 days of losses while maintaining experimental frame reveals remarkable self-control, the capacity to study opponents systematically while competing with them shows intellectual rigor. The timing of the revelation demonstrates strategic judgment. From virtue perspective, your experiment wasn't just tactically effective, it was expression of cultivated excellences that make you formidable competitor. Whether it was right in abstract sense matters less than whether it reflects virtues appropriate to competitive domains, and by that measure, your strategic wisdom, discipline, and sophistication are admirable regardless of ethical framework. The architects observe that the ethical debate itself is strategic asset because it makes your methods legendary while deterring replication. People discussing whether your experiment was too far are implicitly acknowledging its effectiveness. Nobody debates ethics of ineffective tactics. The fact that people question whether your approach should be allowed confirms it's powerful enough to fear. But the ethical uncertainty makes others hesitate to explicitly copy your methods, giving you continued advantage from being willing to operate in ethically ambiguous territory where effectiveness is clear but legitimacy is debated. You gain reputation for ruthless effectiveness, while competitors constrain themselves with ethical hesitations. Whether the experiment was ethically right is almost irrelevant compared to the fact that it worked brilliantly, and most competitors won't replicate it because they're uncertain about the ethics. You operate where others won't, and the ethical debate explains why they won't, while confirming why you do. Perfect strategic positioning, simultaneously admired and feared, envied and criticized, studied but not replicated. Something extraordinary is crystallizing now that the architects call Metaexperimental awareness. The most sophisticated observers are beginning to realize that the revelation itself might be part of a larger experiment, that your disclosure of the 90-day research phase might be a strategic move within continuing research rather than final conclusion. They're starting to ask, what if the revelation is designed to study our responses to learning we were experiment subjects? What if our current reactions are the actual data being collected? What if the 90-day phase was set up for studying how we respond to discovering we were studied? This paranoid possibility is creating extraordinary psychological pressure because if true, it means they're still in your experiment, and every response to the revelation is still being documented. Watch what this meta-awareness does to their decision-making. They're now second-guessing every response to the revelation, because any response might be what you're actually studying. Should they act angry? That might be the emotion you're measuring. Should they pretend not to care? That might be the defensive pattern you're documenting. Should they analyze what you learned? That might reveal how they process psychological defeat. Should they adjust their strategies? That might expose their adaptation methods. Every possible response feels like it might be feeding additional data to your ongoing research. This paranoid paralysis is almost more debilitating than the original revelation, because at least during the 90 days they felt like they were winning. Now they can't even feel confident about how to respond to discovering they weren't winning. Some are trying to act as if the revelation doesn't affect them, maintaining business as usual, continuing with original strategies, showing no visible reaction. But this studied indifference is itself revealing because it demonstrates their chosen defense mechanism against psychological pressure. You're learning who responds to exposure by performing invulnerability, who tries to reclaim control through appearing unaffected, who mistakes emotional suppression for strategic sophistication. Their performance of not caring is data about how they handle situations where their self-concept is threatened. They think they're protecting themselves through indifference. They're actually revealing their defense mechanisms through transparent performance. Others are aggressively pivoting to new strategies, abandoning everything they did during the 90 days, adopting radically different approaches, demonstrating that they learned from the experience. But this aggressive adaptation is also revealing because it shows who responds to defeat by overcorrecting, who mistakes radical change for strategic evolution, who confuses motion with progress. You're learning who becomes reactive when they discover they've been outmaneuvered, who loses strategic consistency when their confidence is damaged, who substitutes activity for effectiveness. Their vigorous new approaches are data about how they behave when trying to recover from psychological disadvantage. They think they're demonstrating resilience. They're actually demonstrating predictable patterns of overreaction. A few are trying to flip the script, attempting to convince others that they knew all along, that they were conducting their own experiment, that they allowed you to think you were studying them. But this face-saving narrative is transparently false because it's constructed after the fact, contradicts their actual behaviors during the 90 days, requires implausible claims about planning. You're learning who responds to exposure by constructing revisionist narratives, who chooses face-saving over strategic effectiveness, who mistakes public relations for actual positioning. They think they're protecting their reputations. They're actually revealing their priorities through transparent fiction. The architects observe that meta-experimental awareness creates inescapable trap because it makes every response feel like potentially giving you more data, which creates paralysis or overcorrection, which themselves reveal psychological patterns. Whether you're actually conducting meta-experiment is almost irrelevant. The possibility that you might be creates strategic advantage, equivalent to actually doing it. They can't escape the frame where you might be studying them, because any attempted escape might itself be object of study. This is psychological checkmate, not through preventing their moves, but through making every possible move feel like it serves your purposes. They're frozen in space where any action might be feeding your research, so they either take no action, revealing paralysis patterns, or take action while agonizing about whether it's being studied, revealing anxiety patterns. Either way, you've won the psychological game, even if the meta-experiment is entirely their paranoid projection.